installment of our PhilForum. If any other master students feel so inclined to present at one of these, I believe Patrick was sending out interest forms, maybe Luca. Somebody has sent out interest forms, but we will continue to do so.
I think it was Mandy, actually.
Was it Mandy? One of them. But yeah, if you don't know already, this is meant to be sort of like an semi-formal, informal opportunity for master students to present their work, or things that they've been sort of interested in, side projects, that sort of thing. This was a paper that I wrote for Herman's hermeneutics of film class, which was really fun, and part of the reason why I wanted to present on this as opposed to something else was that this is one of my favorite movies, and I had a really fun time thinking about it and talking about it in this paper and hopefully with you guys. So I'm going to try not to like read too much, but I did write it in the way that I want to say it, so that might end up being where we are. But and hopefully this doesn't take too long too. There are plenty of clips that I feel the need to show just to fully put together what I'm trying to say. This is also being recorded. If anybody has any objections to that, the actual distribution of this, we haven't necessarily figured it out yet, but we just wanted to have recordings of them. So camera's right there if you have, if you want to angle it yourself or something. But yeah, I guess I will get into it. Right. Angels are watching Berlin. The city is full of the young and the old, the hopeful and the hopeless. They all have fears and desires that they hide from the rest, and they're all pushing through each day in a place with a fractured past and an uncertain future. As much as they feel so, these people aren't alone. The angels have been here since the dawn of time, watching and listening. The angels remember everything, each form the city takes, each thought held by each person. And while they can sometimes influence people's thoughts, they're ultimately out of control, or they cannot control the choices that each Berliner makes. They're essentially condemned to continue observing the city. We are shown a pre-unified city through the eyes of two ever-present angels, Damiel and Cassiel. They appear to be friends as much as immortal beings can be. They often travel through the city together, compare observations, and discuss their existence and the role they play in the city's history. In their observations, however, a shift begins to separate them, a woman. Damiel, on the left there, who from the beginning of the film seems to have held more favor for human existence, is captivated by a trapeze artist named Marion, on the right there. He's captivated by her thoughts and her movements, but arguably most of all by her uniquely human perspective. Her loneliness and stuckness in time is something that he has never experienced, and the more time he spends watching her, the more he desires to descend from his heavenly observation tower and experience what he has only been able to see. From the outset, Wings of Desire is a movie that just brims with philosophical meaning outside of what I'm hoping to talk about. The film poses questions regarding the validity of human existence and experience, the power of interpersonal connection in an increasingly alienating world. There's also themes of German reunification and the role and purpose of the historian, which I don't touch on very much, but one of the sort of side characters is this ailing historian, and that plays a lot into the angels' own reflection on what their role is as observers. Immediately, however, there is a distinct and obvious difference between the world of angels and the world of humans, and that's the color. The angelic perspective is always in black and white, and the human perspective is in technicolor. There's also a difference between the cinematographic composition of both of these perspectives, such that this movie appears at times to be two different films stitched together. I argue, and the thing that I'm hoping to talk about, is that the human perspective and the angelic perspective correspond to Deleuze's theories of the movement image and the time image, respectively, and that the film represents a conversation between the two. So I don't want to get too term laden, but I'm kind of going to shoot through some of his cinematic theory really quick, just to give the impression of what the characteristics are of each of these images, what sort of films they tend to be attributed to, just so we can understand what I mean by this film representing a conversation between them. So he goes over the composition of a film just in sort of a basic way. He breaks it down into the frame, the shot, and the montage, all of which are going to contribute to the effect of the image or the film. The frame is the delimiting factor. It excludes and includes content. It also can imply an angle of framing, which would create perspective. And there's even a sort of double sense of the screen that you are watching a film on being a frame of frames, which would, in his words, force a juxtaposition of qualitatively different views of things within an arbitrarily delineated surface area. The shot is a sort of temporal perspective that acts like a consciousness. Within the shot, objects can change positions and their movement is recorded, but there's also a sense in which the shot is showing us movement. We see the relation between parts, the affection of the whole, but it's movement disengaged from bodies. It's sort of a new consciousness. It's not us, it's not the hero, but it's the camera. The montage finally splices the shots together and forms relationships between them, such that we sort of get this indirect image of time. The montage informs the entire concept of the film. It is what the style is, essentially. So each film is going to be very different depending on how the montage is formed. So together we have the frame isolating a closed set of spatial images, montage assembles the temporal whole, and each shot manifests the spatial repositioning of elements, while simultaneously expressing the movement of durée, or duration, which is a very large concept for him. Deleuze uses Bergson's theory of matter and mind, respectively, to highlight the movement image and the time image, so theory of matter for movement, theory of mind for time. The movement image is attributed to classical cinema, which is the Hollywood early to mid 20th century, while the time image, which we'll get into in a second, is more associated with post-war films, post-World War II. Within the movement image, just again to get a good sense of what these characteristics are, there's three ways in which the scenes of a film can be understood: the perception image, the affection image, and the action image. Each of these flows into another, with the affection image essentially serving, I just italicized it, essentially serving as an intermediary between the initial perception and the subsequent action. So an example of a complete movement image would be we're watching a movie and we see a man step out of a car and he starts looking around the street. And the camera, you can be on his face, see him looking around, and then the camera might switch to look at all the people crossing on the street. And we get the impression that he's looking at all the people on the street. That's sort of the perception image, particularly him looking, and the camera sort of seems to focus on a woman that's walking. And it's not just this blank, I'm just kind of seeing people walk past, but we get the impression that he is looking at this person based on the camera movement, action, the focusing, all of the sort of other compositions of the shot. So that would be the perception image. The image, he also phrases it as the characteristic of the perception of a living being. We see then maybe another shot of the man's face after he sees the woman. He grimaces or stares or has some sort of reaction that we know is in response to his seeing the woman. That's the affection image, which is the power or quality considered for itself as an expressed. And finally, the man moves towards the woman or turns away or just does something. In either case, his action is a response to the affection. That would be the action image, which is going to be what's concerning the actual behavior. So that sort of marks a complete movement image, and that's really characteristic of these classical movies Another way of generally, again, this is pretty general, there's obviously examples that dip into the other, that these movies are capturing and representing. That it's a story, it's clear, it's very obvious what's going on as the viewer. We have then this transition into the time image, and there's a lot of historical and cultural push for this. An increasingly uneasy Europe, and more push for something more artistic. There's more grief and uncertainty, just other things that do start to play into the creation of art that definitely contributes to this. But within the time image, we have this it's sort of beyond the movement. It's a step further than what we were having with these classical movies. These are providing a direct manifestation of time. This is characterized by the breakdown of what we had previously had as a pretty understandable sensory motor schema. Some indications of this, and I'm just gonna fly through these, but just we have pure optical and sonic images, which are the op signs and the son signs, and then we have more complex forms. The heliosigns are crystal images, chronosigns represent the order of time, nosigns, the thought relationship between thought and image, and then the lectosigns are the relationship between the visual and the sonic. So all of these things, and I'll go through a quick sentence on each of them, he finds in these post-war films that are basically questionable, not necessarily confusing, but just not very clear expressions of action or thought or just time generally, that don't follow the same clear progression as the movement image was. So he finds a lot of the pure optical or pure sonic in Italian neo-realist films, where you just have shots that are just giving you image, they're just giving you sound. You're not really following an action, you're not really getting a plot even necessarily, it's just the experience. And in the crystal images, the heliosigns, that's mirror images, so where you have the, as an example, you have the person looking in a mirror and you see both of them and their mirror image present in the same shot, and there's this sort of indiscernibility between the actual image and the virtual image, but they're co-present, so there's that sort of conflict. The chronosigns, messing with the order of time, you have an indiscernibility between what's true and false, so what's actually happening, what's not happening, the right literal order of what's happening. We have he says, instead of just straight up indiscernibility, it's something more undecidable alternatives, inexplicable differences. The thinking image or the new sign is a narrative that comes out of irrational cuts that would represent more what somebody's thoughts are like. It's not following this linear, very clear direction, but it's something dreams, any sort of dream depiction where you're just sort of getting loose impressions. That would be one of those things. And then the reading image, the lectosign, getting this speech act becoming an autonomous creator. We kind of get moments of this in Wings of Desire with written and reading, and how that sort of overlays the rest of the film. Anyways, the whole point of all of this is that we have these characteristics that are attributed to these two types of film. And these were things that I noticed in Wings of Desire, not exclusively, but pretty generally represented with these two different perspectives, the angelic and the human. So what I want to do then is kind of walk through different instances on both ends where they sort of combine, and most of that will end up being through showing clips. I am skipping around almost the entirety of the movie, so I apologize if that becomes problematic, but you should still watch this on your own outside. It is a very, very good movie. Let's introduced to the angels, before we're introduced to Damiel and Cassiel, before we even know the context of the film, we're given a poem. The poem is written by Peter Handke. It's called Song of Childhood. It was written for the movie. It's present literally and figuratively throughout the movie. Damiel's disembodied voice recites it in different parts. At one point, Marion actually recites a part of it. And his hand, we presume, copies it down at the very beginning of the movie, which we will see. That's not too loud, right?
No.
This is going to be annoying. I pulled my timestamps from the Amazon Prime version of this, so
Whoa.
it might just be like a minute off. I'll adjust.
Als das Kind war, ging es mit hängenden Armen, wollte der Bach sei ein Fluss, der Fluss sei ein Strom und diese Pfütze das Meer.
So we get this introduction that will continue in different parts of the film as voiceovers from Damiel and the one time from Marion. For instance, the next encounter with the poem is bookended by the various inner monologues of Berliners, and you start to get the impression that the angels are the ones hearing these, and then they're floating in and out of rooms, just picking up snippets of what each individual person is thinking. And you know that happens for a few minutes. Damiel recites a little bit more of the poem. It happens again for a few minutes. The third instance of the poem recitation occurs during a circus performance for children, where Damiel is marveling at Marion's performance, and Cassiel, his angel friend, is watching him watch her and kind of noticing his, affection for Marion developing. The fourth instance is the one that's recited by Marion. It's during one of her dreams that she's having about Damiel. And finally, the poem is concluded by Damiel as he's walking through the streets of Berlin, having become a human, which is sort of this main crux. He just realizes that he wants to experience the human life, and he, apparently this is possible, decides to become human. And so that is
Genügt niemals Nahrung, Apfel, Brot. Und so ist es immer. Als das Kind war, fielen ihm die Beeren wie nur Beeren in die Hand. Und jetzt immer noch.
And he continues to finish the poem. We see that in each of these sequences, and I only showed you two of them, but that the poem is sort of functioning as a narration that kind of ends up being disconnected from what's actually happening, besides in that first instance where you have the actual written point. At the end of the film, when Damiel's marveling at the love and connection between him and Marion on what appears to be the same piece of paper, he concludes, I know now what no angel knows. And so it's not necessarily an end to the poem, but you get the impression that this entire movie and this entire progression has been being recorded by him, which actually gives it this very, open and shut case. We almost have this full progression, we have this full story, but that's only because he has become human and he is deciding to record it in the way that a human would record a history, a story. Not in his memory as he had as an angel, but written down as a historian would. Sorry about the timestamps, that's so annoying.
weiß jetzt, was kein Engel weiß.
So I think we understand then this weight of his choice to become human. This poem that sort of occupies both spheres of the movement image and the time image is communicated by both human and angel, and in his instance, both as a human and as an angel. It becomes a key part, I think, of the conversation between these two worlds. Its content is pure time images, and its delivery is disconnected from the movement of the speakers. However, it's characterizing his transition into the human world, into the movement image. And you finally sort of get a sense of it being placed within the flow of movement and action because of that final scene. It wraps it up and makes sense. It's not just disembodied. So most of the early scenes of the movie are shot in black and white. You very quickly understand that this is the angel's point of view. The first shift into color occurs when we meet Marion. I'll show this clip later in another discussion, but Daniel's watching her practice her trapeze act, and it's in black and white. You see him sort of perched up at the top of the tent, just watching. And then not only does it shift into color, but the camera angle shifts and it starts following her instead. And so you get a completely different approach to the film, like the actual recording of her movement when it becomes the human perspective, which is really interesting. So then we can sort of take it as a rule, as I said, that we have this black and white angelic perspective, color, human. This sort of, I think, would indicate something more philosophically that Daniel seems to notice in his observations of the humans. Their lives are so much more saturated. They're colorful because they're fleeting. In an early scene, Daniel and Cassiel meet in a car dealership to share their observations of the humans. This is something that is sort of implied as like a pretty consistent thing for them to do. And they're sort of really struck by the different ways in which humans,
In der Strafanstalt platzten sie, hat ein Häftling, bevor er mit dem Kopf gegen die Wand gerannt ist, jetzt gesagt. An der U-Bahn-Station 2 rief der Beamte statt des Stationsnamens plötzlich das Feuerland aus.
Schön.
In den Rehbergen las ein alter Mann ein Kind aus der Odyssee vor. Und der kleine Zuhörer, der dabei ganz zu blinzeln aufhörte. Und du, was hast du zu erzählen?
Eine Passantin, die mitten im Regen den Schirm zusammenklappte, sich nass werden ließ. Ein Schüler, der seinem Lehrer beschrieb, wie ein Farn aus der Erde wächst, und der staunende Lehrer. Eine Blinde, die nach ihrer Uhr tastete, als sie mich spürte. Es ist herrlich, nur geistig zu leben und Tag für Tag für die Ewigkeit von den Leuten rein, was geistig ist, zu bezeugen. Aber manchmal wird mir meine ewige Geistesexistenz zu viel. Ich möchte dann nicht mehr so ewig drüber schweben. Ich möchte ein Gewicht an mir spüren, das die Grenzenlosigkeit an mir aufhebt und mich erdfest macht. Ich möchte bei jedem Schritt oder Windstoß lesen.
So we get a sense there that while he is aware that he gets this wonderful opportunity to testify for all eternity, he wishes to feel a weight within. In his sort of large-scale black and white observations, he feels the pull down to earth, the desire to live within the moments that him and Cassiel exchange notes on. So you already, even, what is this? Yeah, 15 minutes into the film, you're getting a sense of the shift that Daniel's already going through. Along with these sort of color changes, like I mentioned, there's this difference between the camera techniques as well, between the two perspectives. from Damiel and Cassiel's point of view, we glide through walls, fly through and above the city, we move with cars and trains. Each scene in black and white then takes on somewhat of a God's eye view. We see everything without limit or uniqueness. And there's a freedom of movement even in this perspective, because the angels aren't in situation like the humans. Though this freedom and this ability to not necessarily stick with one thing starts to sort of eat at Damiel. We're going to spend a couple minutes watching this one clip that I think is a really, really good example of this time image characteristic, and also has, I think, a further development with the conversation between the two. So this is a scene of a car accident that Daniel comes upon. You'll see right at the beginning that we approach the car accident as from Daniel's perspective, but it also seems to be from the perspective of a car, which is quite interesting. But it sort of attributes to what I was saying about their movement isn't just them walking around the city. So what follows here is what's in the script called the Invocation of the World. It's a comforting technique, I guess, that Damiel is employing to help ease this man into death and what I would like to consider from the movement image into the time image, this sort of shift out of the human world. He is pulling memories and just snippets characteristic of the time image from the man's thoughts and trying to sort of coax the man into remembering these things for himself, not focusing on his worries. You just saw him going, I've got so much to do, I can't just go. One thing that's really interesting that I'll sort of go over again after we watch is the camera movement during this scene, which was something that somebody pointed out, how the different vocal changes with the camera, which is, interesting. But anyways, we'll just watch
Wie
it.
ich bergauf ging und aus dem Talnebel in die Sonne kam. Das Feuer am Rand der Viehweide, die Kartoffeln der Asche, das Bootshaus weit draußen im See, das Kreuz des Südens, der ferne Osten, der hohe Norden, der ewige Westen,
der große Quellensee, die Insel Tristan und Kuhn, das Delta des Mississippi, Stromboli, die einzelne heiße Schale wird Albert gekommen. Das Morgenlicht,
Sag mal, was steht ihr denn da wieder alle rum?
das
Ist doch was Gutes.
Augenpaar des
Hat wenigstens jemand
Kindes,
Notarzt gerufen?
das Schlimmste.
Kommt jetzt auch drauf, der muss ein Jailbruch.
So this film critic Richard Raskin notes that each track from left to right, right to left, something about the invocation is changing. In the first track, it's just Daniel speaking. On the way back, it's both of them. On the way back, it's just the man, which I just honestly found pretty interesting. Again, this sort of recording of what's going on that isn't just, okay, camera in front, and it's very clear that we're like listening to this man's thoughts, and then, something's gonna happen, and he's gonna die, and then Daniel gets up and moves. That there's a movement and a sort of perception outside of what's actually going on in the scene that may or may not be corresponding to the actual invocation, but we're sort of just the camera having its own mind and its own perspective in the face of this very traumatic event for this man who does not want to leave the thing that he's used to, this movement of the human world. What's being captured doesn't really have this predetermined trajectory. It's just existing in time, and in this scene, among many others, in this black and white perspective, we're witnessing time without any sort of movement that would typically be accompanying it and explaining its passing. For all the emotion and the gravity of the scene, nothing is particularly happening. But the camera continues to record. We're still given a perspective, and we can view through this Daniel guiding the dying man out of the world of the living. This camera perspective that is unique to the time image, or it is unique to the time image because it's presenting the viewer with just pure optical and sonic images, which are some of its characteristic signs. Once the dying man begins listing the memories on his own, we see the young man running up behind him. He's asking the other bystanders why they haven't called the police or calling a doctor. The real world action is sort of catching up with us again. We're starting to kind of get back into like the actual movie, the movement. Daniel realizes he's sort of done his part and lets the young man who ran up take his place. However, as he walks away, we still continue to hear the invocation. We still hear the young man's thoughts, and they actually become, it's a stronger voice. He's not, dying. It doesn't sound like he's dying anymore. He sounds more confident. He sounds more in place. So for about a minute longer, this list continues, and we're going to see it with images of Daniel sort of moving through the city again. Again, the things that he is invoking, the memories that he's bringing up, have nothing to do with what we're actually seeing.
Die Fläche ist Morgens, die Sonne, das Brot und der Wein, der Hüpfschritt, das Osterfest, die Adern der Blätter, das wehende Gras, die Farben der Steine, die Kiesel auf dem Grunde des Bachbetts, das weiße Tischtuch im Freien, der Traum vom Haus im Haus, der schlafende Nächste im Nebenraum, die Ruhe des Sonntags, der Horizont, der Lichtschein vom Zimmer im Garten, das Nachtflugzeug, das freihändig Radfahren, die schöne Unbekannte, mein Vater, meine Mutter, meine Frau, mein Kind.
We are seeing in the rest of this scene, these sort of pure images that are of Daniel's world that he is very clearly starting to wish that he could break free from. We're perceiving his perception, his impartial, all-encompassing view of Berlin, his unfiltered access to the thoughts of the people below him, and both Daniel and us, the viewer, become aware of this paradox that's sort of plaguing the angels. They have total freedom, but they're very limited within their sort of lack of situated experience. What powers this scene most of all, I think, as many of you could probably tell, is this invocation. It's a very emotional and intense explanation, I guess, of what it means to be human. Daniel and the other angels are occupying the world at the time image, and we're made to understand this through the style, but there's also the fact that the angelic world is the time image. They're beyond the action and movement of the human world, and are perceiving time directly as it exists outside of what it determines. At the beginning of the scene, the man is anxious about leaving the world of the movement image that he's so familiar with. His regrets, I should have told her yesterday that I was sorry. are accentuated by the anxiety he feels at simply being observed, how they all stand there staring at me. Damiel's task then is to comfort the man not only as he transitions from life to death, but also as he moves from the movement image into the time image. He accomplishes this by drawing instances up from the man's psyche that bring him comfort. Each of those examples that are contained in the invocation are untethered. They just exist as memory without any links to movement. And the man's worries start to fade as he's soothed by these instances. Damiel, on the other hand, is sort of haunted by these images as he walks away, even as he attempts to turn his attention elsewhere. We see him, they sit up on this statue pretty frequently, and it sort of serves as their, I'm going to kind of shoot down and think, listen to what's going on over here, and I'm going to listen to what's going on over here. And there's sort of, I think, the impression in that, at the end of that scene, that he is unable to distract himself from this man's memories. They're sort of familiar to him in that they're these moments of pure perception, but they're really unfamiliar because he only knows them as such. He doesn't know them in phenomenal experience, in his current form at least. So we have this black and white perspective of the angels being constituted by scenes like this. If we weren't honestly seeing this steadily increase into a color film, it wouldn't necessarily be this conversation. Damiel, I think, is struggling at the center of the conversation between the movement image and the time image, and we'll obviously see some more examples of the movement soon. Anytime he has to comfort a human in crisis, he engages in this conversation and is presented with both ways of existing. This dialogue is built into the literal interactions between the humans and the angels, but also this overall cinematic interaction between these two different scenes. So the first, moving into the movement image and the color, the first instance of this change occurs when Damiel stumbles upon the circus, and I said we'd kind of check out this shift because it really is pretty cool.
Imagine que tu es une colombe.
Alors, partons boîte alors. Et vous, bande de moineaux, à quoi vous jouez? Je croirais au bal des pompiers.
Jetzt ist genug! Konzentrier dich, Mario!
Was hier gibt sich viele Mühe mit dem lieben Federvieh. Mario, reiß dich zusammen.
Reiß dich zusammen. Natürlich reiß ich mich zusammen. Was glaubt ihr, was ich hier tue? Ich wäre euch schon längst auf den Kopf gefallen, wenn ich mich nicht zusammenreißen würde.
Komm mal her!
So you see that even not just the difference in color, but the actual camera perspective shift. You can immediately tell that there's a shift, not just in style, but in perspective. We also aren't seeing Damiel in those color scenes. He's not present for us. The focus of the shot seems to really just be solely on her experience of swinging across the tent rather than this all-encompassing objective view. In this first instance of color, we and possibly Damiel get to experience the human point of view before returning to this world. We see her in color again about 10 minutes later when Damiel's in her trailer listening to her muse over her future. We kind of saw the beginning of this. This is right before the scene with the motorcycle accident. He attempts to pick up one of her stones. He can only really get this sort of spectral version of it. It's very obvious, I think, that he is infatuated by her. He becomes really transfixed by the curve of her shoulder and her neck. Not necessarily, I would say, in a sexual way, but just in this, it's such a small part, and maybe even overlooked part of the human body that he is just so caught up in and mesmerized by. We're spending a lot of time right here with her thoughts, and he's perceiving them. He's understanding her loneliness.
Tu
But
sais qu'il me cesse de me rendre maladroit.
When she fades to color, in just a moment, you know, we lose her thoughts, we lose what he's actually seeing, and we kind of shift into what her perspective of this is. This is a particularly, you know, strong example of that switch to the movement image,
Envie d'aimer.
where again her thoughts are going to cut off and we kind of just get the impression of her musing that we wouldn't have necessarily gotten before we were seeing her from Daniel's perspective. Now she's sort of distracting herself from maybe the anxiety that the end of her career might be, that the circus has just been canceled. She's moving and not just literally, she's sort of required now to react to her perceptions and to process her affections. You know, she tries to juggle these oranges and just think of something other than the anxiety that was sort of plaguing her a moment ago. We're not watching her anymore as Damiel does, but we're just sort of experiencing the same compulsion that she feels in response to her worries. The color switches continue to happen frequently throughout the film, but the most prominent scene really is when Damiel becomes human. This has sort of been our main character. Him going through this switch is going to mark like a pretty solid. We still get Cassiel's perspective occasionally, but this scene's very interesting. Damiel and Cassiel meet at the Berlin Wall, which is, you know, that it's taking a place at the physical symbol of division currently in the city is not really a coincidence. The division between two worlds, essentially. He announces to Cassiel that he's ready to take the plunge, and that transition, we'll watch that as well.
Dann kaufe ich mir eine Zeitung und lese sie von den Schlagzeilen bis zum Horoskop. Am ersten Tag werde ich mich nur bedienen lassen. Wer was von mir will, den weise ich weiter zum Nebenmann. Wer über meine ausgestreckten Beine stolpert, wird sich höflichst bei mir entschuldigen. Ich werde mich anrempeln lassen und zurückrempeln. Der Wirt im vollen Lokal wird mir sofort einen freien Tisch finden. Auf der Straße wird ein Dienstwagen vor mir halten und der Bürgermeister wird mich ein Stück mitnehmen. Jedem werde ich bekannt vorkommen und niemandem verdächtig. Kein Wort werde ich sprechen und jede Sprache verstehen. Das wird mein erster Tag sein.
Aber nichts davon wird wahr sein.
Ich werde sie in den Arm nehmen. Sie wird mich in den Arm nehmen.
Another fun instance of the camera sort of panning. So Cassiel presumably drops him off on the other side of the wall, and we have this switch for a good portion of the film where Daniel is human. There's sort of an interesting bit of lore here. There's an actor who had also been an angel, who somehow is involved with this suit of armor dropping on his head. It's never really fully explained, but it gives him the opportunity to do something, to sell something. But even now, we're just getting this very, you know, obvious instant. He perceives something happening, he has a reaction to it, and he's going to act accordingly. There's also the camera is much steadier in these scenes. We're not getting this sort of free-floating move. The character of the scenes in color is much different than it was in black and white. So, you know, he's looking around, he's deciding where to go, he picks a direction and he goes, and we watch him go. It's much more obvious that there's an action that we're following that makes sense as he sort of transitioned into the world of the movement image. reaches up and feels where he was hit, and he realizes that he's been bleeding, that he's hurt, which is obviously very new for him. And then he approaches the man.
Ist das rot?
Haben Sie sich verletzt?
Heute geht's gut. Und die Rohre?
Rohre sind gelb.
Gelb.
Ja.
Und der da?
Der ist grau-blau.
Graublau. Der?
Lila.
Der?
Der ist orange. Ocker.
Ocker? Oder orange?
Ocker.
Ocker. Gelb,
Das
rot,
ist gelb.
der?
Der ist grün.
Grün. Und das oben über dem Auge?
Der ist blau.
Das ist blau. Blau. Ist es heute sehr kalt?
Ah, das geht vorbei.
Ach, ich würde so gerne einen Kaffee trinken.
Haben Sie kein Geld?
Ja. Nein.
But again, just that we're
Germans are so
that we're stuck on this scene watching the action unfold. It's no longer what we're hearing is very much connected to what we're seeing. There's just a very obvious difference. He gets some money from this man and he buys a cheap coffee from a stand and relishes its bitter flavor and the burning sensation. I mean, you even get the sense of when he tastes his blood and says, "Oh, it has a taste." I'm starting to understand that all of these things that again we would not necessarily pay much attention to are very novel for him. He has this very kind of childlike approach to the world. This is literally his first day on Earth, not just above it. All the while we're sort of getting this very strong sense of the movement image. Daniel's phenomenally experiencing the world around him and reacting to it, which has been wholly different from the angelic perspective that we've been used to, that he was used to. The remainder of the film follows mostly the structure typical of classical cinema that Deleuze associates with the movement image. Daniel searches across the city for Marion. The two eventually meet face to face and confess their love, and we have this sort of storybook ending, all things considered. There are crossovers, of course. Cassiel continues to keep an eye on Daniel. We get the black and white perspective from him. Cassiel also tries to understand where Daniel's coming from. But he just kind of can't really seem to cross that boundary necessarily. Additionally, as we saw, that's the poem Song of Childhood finishes in Daniel's voiceover while he's human and in color, such that it's not something that's restricted to the angelic perspective. So again, that's another moment of conversation between the two. We saw the direct comparison between the first and the last scenes with him writing down something, starting with a poem and then sort of ending with a reflection. He seems to be recounting his story on paper. Overall, though, we have a good sense that these two sides of the film have their unique characteristics, even when there are instances of the movement image or the time image in their sort of non-respective places. This bleeding into one another is an important way that this movie, I think, provides a backdrop for this interaction between these two components of Deleuze's theory. It's not enough to just stitch two filming styles together, but they have to interact. They have to meld into one another in order for it to be a proper conversation. In sum, there's a lot of philosophical depth to this movie, not just in its content, but in its form. Viewing it, I think, from this lens of Deleuze's cinematic theory adds a really interesting level to the understanding between the difference of the world between the angels and the humans. For the angels, for all their freedom of movement, they are essentially confined to an outside perspective. They can never truly experience all of the things that they observe. But the humans are also restricted by time. They can't understand. They have trouble understanding one another or even themselves, which we see in their worries and their anxieties that the angels are picking up on. But through the melding of these two perspectives, we have something really magical occurring. Daniel's amazement at his and Marion's love is affected by his previous angelic perception of the world, and he's all the more grateful for the opportunity to experience what he's only seen. Movement and time fold together. Sometimes one dominates the other, but they're both always there, dancing through and around each other. This movie is expressing this conversation about image through image, which I believe it enhances its effect even more. And yeah,
Who has the first question?
it's not a very question spawning person.
I noticed that in the motorist accident, when you pointed this out, when he approaches, it's kind of like he's just sort of like floating, you know, like kind of like a car. He's just sort of like gliding along towards the accident. But and you don't see him, you see it as his perspective. But when he's leaving, you see him and he's walking away. So I think that, like, if that's the scene, that's one of the points marking the sort of transition or the blending of the time and the movement image, you see it in how the scene begins and how it ends. It begins with sort of a time image movement, if you will, and it ends with a movement image movement. And then also at the end, when he gets dropped off on the other side of the wall, I mean, you pointed out, yeah, he gets hit in the head, he tastes his blood. He's like, he is situated now, and he's experiencing things phenomenally. But part of his situatedness isn't just that he experiences things phenomenally, but he's also experienced phenomenally. And that's represented by the kids seeing him. And they're staring at him and they go, oh, I think he's drunk.
Yeah.
So like that's part of being embodied, is not only are you experiencing things within situation, but you're experienced within situation as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, and it's you know, I never obviously wanted to just be like, well, there's just one characteristic about one side, and you know, they're very separate, because it is a really unique film, and you know, I actually didn't look too much into it. I don't believe that Wim Wenders is like, you know, trying to necessarily. I mean, I think he's aware, of course, that the styles are different and that they're meant to sort of invoke different impressions, but that they don't have to be completely exclusive from one another, and that our lives can be kind of splattered with moments of us sort of moving beyond or sort of floating above what we're actually experiencing. We're not always there. I think ultimately we're there. We're born and we die, and we have to follow this path of like linear, obvious time. But we can have moments where we step outside of it, and but you know, yeah. Anyways,
this is not a question that will likely forward the discussion at all. This is simply my lack of understanding of Deleuze. So he has these two notions of movement image and the time image. And you made the connection to Bergson. So from what I remember, Bergson, like, he's arguing that the notion we have of like point time is not representative of real time. What's real is duration. Duration is fluid, it's movement, it's constant, and point time is an abstraction that was generated by our psyches for the purpose of utility, that we need to acquire things, we need to cut apart the world into manageable parts or discrete parts. So I guess of those two aspects, I guess like the movement image for Deleuze obviously corresponds to duration, and the time image corresponds to point time, or the, I can't remember what the term Bergson uses.
do you know the direct term?
I can do this.
I can do this.
I can if you wanna. Do you have a response?
I was just gonna say, I think he could see very obviously how this would be attributed to cinema, to like a moving image. The representations of time and how, for the most part, these classical movies were representing our experience of time. There's an obvious flow that, you know, we have to sort of move through, and whereas these post-war ones tend to be these sort of maybe more real experiences of time where they're just kind of like it's all encompassing, it's everything, but it's not necessarily broken up into things that we can understand. But I think if you want more, I'm not familiar with Brookstone, so that would be Seth.
Yeah.
Is there chalk up there?
Yeah, there's like tiny pieces.
So Dure actually, I think, encompasses both the movement image and the time image, and point time isn't totally like a fabrication or a construct of our psyche. So it's just so Dure can exist in different like concentrations or contractions and expansions, and so material existence is point time existence. And he has this diagram in Matter and Memory where this is a plane right here. So this point is on the plane, we're looking at the plane, not actually it might be easier to look at it this way. So this is a plane that like extends this way, but we're looking at it, you know. So this would be the present, and so matter only ever exists in the present. So the Dure of matter is one of causality. And so that in a sense is the movement image, because the current moment is informed by the previous moment and informs the following moment. So it can never escape this cycle of causality. And the movement image is the same in the sense of you have a perception, you have an affection, and then you have a response. So it's a chain of events, and the response is going to give you a new perception that will give you a new affection that will give you a new response, and so on and so forth. So it's all chained together. So the memory part, so this is the matter part of matter and memory, but it's all in Dure. So the memory part is that as conscious beings, we're temporally ecstatic, so we sort of stretch or like flee from ourselves. We escape the present by recalling the past and anticipating the future. So in recollecting the past, we have information essentially that exists outside of the present. So if we existed like matter did, only in the present, the information of the past, i.e. our memories, would be inaccessible. But because of our existence as like a temporally ecstatic being, we can bring in the information from the past through our memories, and that opens up more possibilities than what would only be available if we existed like matter solely within the present. So this would be extending into the past. You know, we can bring in this information to the present to access more possibilities. And same thing with the future. Our anticipations of the future orient the present based on our intentionality, our projects. And so the time image is a gap in the movement image, where again the movement image is operating like matter does in the present, where it's a cycle, it's a chain of causality. The time image is a gap somewhere, where you don't have an affection image coming immediately from a perception image and a reaction immediately following that. But you have a gap, say, in the perception, where you have the pure op sign or the pure son sign, where like with the motorist dying, he's caught up in the movement image of, oh, I still had to do this errand, oh, I should have told my girlfriend that I was sorry about that, oh, I still have, you know, all these ambitions and dreams and whatnot. So he's caught up in the cycle of action, where what breaks him out of that, what comforts him, is pure, the pure time images that Damiel pulls from his memory. So he's taking him out of the cycle of causality, the cycle of reaction, to give him the sort of like pure son or pure op sign or pure electo sign that breaks him out of that causality, so he doesn't have the anxiety of continuing it, you know. And so like you can think of this like in a Buddhist sense too, like the karmic cycle is like here in the plane of the present. It's like the movement image.
Right.
Your current actions are informed by your past ones and will inform your future ones. So the cycle of samsara is like matter or like movement image, but breaking out of that with non-judgmental awareness, where you're able to take a pure perception without feeling an affection towards it that drives you to a reaction. You can just take it as a perception. That's the time image.
Oh, that's helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me hijack that for a second.
Yeah.
But it's all within Dure.
Okay, yeah, Dure is. For some reason I was thinking that duration corresponds to memory in a unique way, but that was not helpful.
It does. It does, but it's just that both the material existence in like the plane of the present and the ecstatic temporalization bringing in the past and stretching towards the future, all of that's Dure. It's just that it's different.
Expansions and contractions.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question, but it's related to a comment. But I'm gonna just have to elaborate this first. So time is usually distinguished in multiple different ways. So we often order events in terms of like pastness, presentness, and futurity, things like that. But also we could do it tenselessly too. So like simply ordering events earlier and later. So some events, like let's say World War I, are earlier than World War II, but in that description there's no present. It's simply just that purely static kind of way of framing the relationship between those events. Now, it seems to me that in the film itself, there's like a difference between the content, from what I saw, and from what you were saying, there's a difference between the human perspective, of course, and the perspective of the angels. So it seems the human perspective, we have this tensed sense of time. So we have this pastness, presentness, and futurity that characterizes the movement image, it seems, yes. And you do not get that in the case of the angels. It's much more of a static conception. So things are from a, not from the standpoint of eternity, so to speak, because they are, in a sense, kind of, in some way or another, they are in the scene, but they're not actually a part of the scene, but they're observing it, nevertheless. So for the angels, it seems earlier and later then. That's really what characterizes their experience. And then once we see Bruno Ganz, he becomes the human, you see a radical transition there in terms of like time and things like that, as well as with respect to him being the one observed now. People can actually see him. But my question is, so in the movie itself, the actual form side of the movie, if you have like a film reel, right, and the entire movie is laid out in that reel of film, you're going to have these different blocks. So first you start off with, like, let's say the angels, then you're going to go to the human perspective, angel perspective, human perspective, and so on. And you have this purely serial arrangement. Now, the film, in a sense, is a unitary whole. And when it's not being watched, of course, all of these events are purely simultaneous with one another. There's no real pastness, presentness, or futurity about it. But when we're watching the movie, you see this kind of, how would you make sense of how would you classify the film itself as opposed to merely the sections or chunks of the film in terms of this one capturing the movement image or this one capturing the time image? Not so much from the standpoint of just the film in a purely like material sense, like, okay, these events are going to be, okay, before and after another or whatever, but from the actual subjective side of the actual experiencing of the film, how would you characterize that, so to speak, in terms of these Deleuze's way of understanding film, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a sidebar, but one of the things that we spoke about in class, so the first movie we watched in this class was Paris, Texas, so another one of Bender's movies. Very different from this one. But we sort of gathered that in the movie there's this really strong critique of the image, and it's a pretty strong theme, but it's also being presented through an image. And so that was sort of a topic of conversation. We're like, can you critique something while engaging in it? And that's your comment is sort of reminding me of that there is still a sense in which there's a beginning of the movie and then a straightforward linear watching of the movie and then it's over, especially from the viewer's perspective. But I think that he does a good job of characterizing these moments in that, while you do start to get a sense that Damiel is wanting to become a human, wanting to kind of move into this, the angelic scenes are still a little out of time. Even, watching the whole, and it's kind of hard, I think, to really show that without just like showing the entire movie, which you should watch. But even each time we go to see these things, we're seeing, there's a scene where Cassiel attempts to comfort a man who's sitting on the top of a building. He's going to jump off. And that's where you really get a sense that they don't really have full control over us. They can kind of influence, they can kind of try to give bring up a better memory, try to give a little bit of a push in the right direction. But ultimately, the man still jumps. And Cassiel has a moment where he's kind of like reconciling with that, and he doesn't really understand. He jumps off of the statue to try to like see what the feeling is. So, but apart from that position of that scene has nothing to do with the scenes around it. It's just sort of let's cut back to the angels, like what are they up to? And so I think that in the experience of watching it, while you are ultimately, because it's a movie, because you've sat down for a certain amount of time, you are kind of following this very, obvious experience of before, present, after, even as you're watching it, you're remembering what you just saw and anticipating that something will continue. The moments, I think, of the black and white perspective do feel like just pure experience sometimes. So even if you step back and kind of are aware that I'm watching a movie, there's a purpose to all of this, or there's like a movement, an idea that's happening, you can still just, I think, experience and really get wrapped up in those moments as just like sort of pure, a little bit outside of the rest of the action. I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's, I think too, the actual the end of the movie is not him finishing up this written part. The actual last scene is Cassiel observing this old man, this historian that I brought up at the very beginning. And then, so you sort of get this like other side of how this movie's ending. It's not necessarily just this, very interesting love story where, he gets the girl and then they're happy together. There's also this little kind of tidbit thrown at the end that comments on the role of the historian and the role of who's measuring human existence, who's, attributing meaning to it. And I find that a very interesting way to end it. It doesn't feel like it should be the end. That feels like it should have come at some other point. But that, I think, also would contribute to a full watch of just you aren't just left with a conclusion, you're left with another musing of what the point of like documenting the full unfolding of time is. And for an angel who can they understand and they'll talk about the ways that the city has changed. It's like there's one part, I think it's right before Damiel changes, they're talking about how, it's like, remember when this was just like a riverbank and they were like fighting with sticks, and like, they have this full view, and they do have a sense in which this thing came before that, but ultimately they just know that they're just there for it all kind of at once. Thank you guys for coming. If anybody else has, I definitely would recommend watching it. There's surprisingly a lot of other parts that I didn't mention that I'm like, oh, that was interesting too, but I won't get into all of it. But thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.